So the right has, for a long time, decried media bias. But in recent history, the right hasn't talked too much about whether individual stations are violating the public interest element of broadcast licensing. And that's really interesting because you came in here on the heels of the last 10 years. Media trust is tied for a record low again. And you're starting to talk, for example, this was you responding to the axing of Stephen Colbert and The Late Show by saying, quote, broadcasters, they have a federal license and they're obligated to operate in the public interest. And to the extent that we're starting to see some changes, I think that's a good thing. So I kind of just want to start with the basics here, like even technically and historically. What does it mean that the FCC allocates broadcast licensing? And how are you thinking about the question of public interest?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, in part because we are seeing right now some real seismic changes and shifts in the media landscape. And just to level set, there's a couple different types of sort of speakers that are out there. So obviously you have your podcast, you've got people that speak on X, formerly Twitter, you've got cable channels, but then you've got broadcast TV and radio. And broadcast TV and radio is in a category unto itself, different from all those other mediums for a couple of reasons. But one is because they're licensed by the FCC and they're required by federal law to operate in the public interest. And again, cable channels aren't licensed by the FCC, although I do get a lot of tweets about whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or CNN. We don't license them, but we do license broadcast radio, broadcast TV. Then even within that broadcast space, I think you got to draw a quick distinction. On the one hand, you have what are called national programmers. These are like ABC, CBS, NBC. They also own some TV stations, but in the main, they're the ones that produce all the programming that is then aired over broadcast TV stations. And in the majority of cases, those broadcast TV stations are owned by entirely different entities. And so you've got two different types of players in the broadcast space. And what we're trying to do as a policy matter at the FCC is to empower the owners of the actual licensed TV stations to feel like they have the freedom to serve the interests of their local communities. Because for too long, the FCC has stepped back from enforcing the public interest mandate. The results sort of speak for themselves. These national programmers, based on executives that live usually in New York or Hollywood, are creating this content that's then getting pushed down and out through the local broadcasters. And I don't think the FCC has done the industry or the American public any favors by not enforcing the public interest mandate. So that's what we're focused on. And again, it comes at a very interesting shifting time in the media landscape as a general matter.
So this is really interesting because back in, 2020, when big tech was censoring conservatives, you were an absolute leader in that space of free speech, and you're getting criticized now. I saw this Dispatch article pulling quotes that said, in 2020, you said a newsroom's decision about what stories to cover and how to frame them should be beyond the reach of any government official, criticized the injection of partisan politics into our licensing process, said the FCC is operating as the nation's speech police by saying if ever there were a time for a federal agency to show restraint, when it comes to the regulation of political speech and to ensure that it is operating within the statutorily defined bounds of its authority, now would be that time. What's interesting about what you just said with all of that is it sounds to me like you see using the public interest actually as a free speech issue in and of itself and not mutually exclusive with what you've said in the past, despite what your critics are saying now. So is that the case? Are these two in the same vein about free speech at the end of the day from your perspective?
Yeah, these are entirely consistent. So those remarks that you referred to, the context there was Democrats in Congress who were writing letters to cable companies like Comcast and urging them to drop cable channels like Fox News, OAN, and Newsmax based on the political viewpoints of the newsrooms. And again, cable channels are fundamentally different than broadcast channels. So broadcast TV stations have this obligation to operate in the public interest. And I very firmly believe that we need to have more speech, more diversity of opinion. Obviously, that's sacrosanct on the internet, on social media. I think that's a good thing. When it comes to broadcasters, though, there is that obligation to be in the public interest. And one of the things that's interesting is if you look, for instance, at CBS. So CBS recently had a transaction before the FCC. They're being purchased by Skydance. One of the things that the new purchasers said in the FCC record was if this transaction goes through, they're going to commit to a greater connection with fact-based journalism, with objective reporting, and with what they described as diversity of viewpoints across the political and ideological spectrum. And I think that's such welcome news. And frankly, it's not just a regulatory thing. I do think it's something that the marketplace is demanding. Again, just look at Colbert. We could talk more about that. But I think that's a sign of where the marketplace is changing dramatically right now.
Yeah, so you don't believe that it encroaches on free speech to say, if you are a broadcast network, the public interest should mean that you are broadcasting kind of across the political spectrum and the mainstream spectrum, and you're doing your best to be fair and balanced, as people say. If you are licensed to operate in the public interest, it's not an encroachment on free speech so much as it is, so much as it is about that umbrella definition of the public interest. That has to be, again, like, as somebody who comes from years of free speech activism, essentially, like that has to be, from your perspective, something you're thinking about balancing all of the time.
Yeah, there is something just fundamentally different about a broadcast license, because again, when the government says you get to use these 6 megahertz of airwaves, we're necessarily denying other speakers the ability to use those 6 megahertz of airwaves for their own political viewpoints. That's why the government imposes a mandate that is different than a cable channel, different than a podcast. And how the FCC has defined the public interest in the broadcast space over the years is a couple ways. One, they say you need to be responsive to the needs of your local communities. They talk about diversity of viewpoints. And so they would talk about competition as well. So there's lots of features of the public interest standard. And I do think that it's incumbent on broadcasters to meet that, and frankly, incumbent on the FCC to reinvigorate our enforcement. And if broadcasters don't like it, if they don't want a public interest obligation, that's fine. The FCC's address is 45 L Street. They can take their federal license, they can put it in the mail, and they can become a cable channel, or they become a podcast. That's perfectly fine. But if you want the benefit of using this public resource, a scarce public resource, you got to hold up your end of the bargain. And again, that's why I was glad to see CBS make some commitments in that direction. And hopefully we'll see a course correction across the board as well.
And maybe one even that benefits the left, too, because there are a lot of people on the populist left who feel shut out of the kind of mainstream discourse. They have their own issues with the elite Democrats, for example, who were involved in basically trying to get Bernie Sanders, as we now know, to be defeated by Hillary Clinton in 2016 and to shut him out of the race in 2020. So I guess, Chairman Carr, there's an argument perhaps that this isn't just beneficial to the right, that it could also probably be helpful to the populist left in some circumstances as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, it's principally a particular set of executives. Again, they're mostly in New York, mostly in Hollywood. And it's been their viewpoint or their lack of diversity of viewpoint that has been the predominant factor in media over the last couple of years. And look, there is a real sort of crisis taking place in the legacy mainstream media right now. I mean, just look at the number of stories over the last 4 or 5 years where there's just been massive misses and consistent misses across all of these different legacy outlets, whether it's, Russiagate, whether it was the Russian bounties in the Middle East, whether it was, if you remember, sort of the whips at the border, or the, Jussie Smollett, mostly peaceful protests, Covington Catholic. I mean, something has gone seriously awry that these, significant major stories, the Hunter Biden laptop story, President Biden's mental acuity, just were all missed. And so I do think, there's definitely a need for a course correction. I think in the main, it happens from the market. But again, I don't think you can overlook the role that President Trump is playing here. And he's playing a very important role where I think President Trump is fundamentally reshaping the media landscape, but not necessarily in the ways or that a lot of people think about it. I think what he's done is he's helped facilitate a much broader macro movement. So for instance, when President Trump ran for election, he ran directly at the legacy mainstream media, and he smashed through the facade that, again, these executives in New York and Hollywood get to control the narrative. They get to decide what everyday people think and are allowed to say. And he was really speaking up for American people who simply don't trust the mainstream media anymore. And once they've lost that gatekeeper status, there's a lot of different consequences that flow from that. Again, I think that broader trend is why you see Colbert Show ending and them struggling, and other shows similarly. But I think it goes back to President Trump, because most politicians, they just simply accepted the narrative that the mainstream media dictated, and they felt constrained to operate within the terms that they set. And President Trump upended that. And again, if you look at all of the changes that are taking place already since President Trump has won the election, in terms of the reshaping the media landscape, it's pretty impressive. You got PBS defunded, you've got NPR defunded, you've got Colbert Show ending, you've got Joy Reid out at MSNBC, Lester Holt out at NBC, you've got Terry Moran gone at ABC, you've got these new owners of CBS committing to more fact-based, objective reporting. ABC reached a settlement with Trump, CBS reached a settlement with Trump. You got Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, committing their editorial board to a different approach on their editorials, and people quitting because they didn't want to run patriotic op-eds over there. So I do think that there's a fundamental shift taking place. I think you do have to look at Trump as part of the reason for that. But again, in a much bigger macro picture way, it's not, sort of the nefarious picking up the phone and, bullying people that some of the reporters want to sort of attribute it to. And again, I think the reason why they look at that is they don't want to grasp or deal with that much bigger picture changes that's taking place in media right now.
Yeah, because that's where this gets into a lot of the media criticism, and actually probably criticism from some folks on the Hill as well. Definitely some criticism from some folks on the Hill as well, because there's what you're doing at the FCC, and it's not happening in a vacuum, because it's also happening with what Donald Trump is doing, sort of with the bully pulpit and Truth Social and his various statements about his own different political enemies. So, Chairman, I wanted to get you to respond to the rendition of all of this, because you just mentioned the sort of picking up the phone and making those kind of backroom deals or whatever. I wanted to get you to respond to this rendition. Speaking of cable being different than broadcast networks, on South Park, and see what we can talk about on the other side of it. We can go ahead and roll the South Park clip.
Break bread with me. This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Now just eat the bread and listen. I didn't want to come back and be in the school, but I had to because it was part of a lawsuit and the agreement with Paramount.
The president's suing you?
The guy can do whatever he wants now that someone back down, okay? Eat the bread, eat the bread. You guys saw what happened to CBS? Yeah, well, guess who owns CBS? Paramount. You really want to end up like Colbert? You guys gotta stop being stupid.
We can't understand you.
Just shut up, or we're going to get canceled, you idiots.
Tom, they're calling it the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay, Chairman. So is that protected speech? And what is that rendering of how this is all going down, getting right or wrong from your perspective?
Yeah, I think everyone's trying to look for the tree, and they're missing the forest, right? Of that broader trend line of, once President Trump ran the legacy national media and he sort of removed their gatekeeper status. Once you had social media like X embrace free speech, people had access to news and information. And so, running just a partisan carnival, I think the way the Colbert Show was, is simply just not very good business. And satire is awesome, right? Satire is probably one of the most fundamental and early aspects of free speech in all of democracy. And people should feel free to make fun of people that are in positions of power, whether it's the president or myself. I mean, trust me, I get my fair share of ribbing. I'm not doing my job until I get made fun of more in some of these shows. I mean, it reminds me, there was a former FCC chairman, Newt Minow, who talked about broadcast TV at the time being what he gave this famous speech that described it as the vast wasteland, and broadcasters didn't like it. And that's why you saw sort of the SS Minnow was the famous ship on Gilligan's Island, was named after an FCC chairman. So that's the mark that I need to try to at least hit or exceed. But I think also, when you look at comedy, you look at these late night shows, again, satire is great. We want it, make fun of everybody. I think it's part of what makes for democracy. But a lot of these late night shows went from, there's an op-ed that described this, that they basically went from being court jesters making fun of everybody to court clerics, where instead of going for laugh lines, they were going for applause lines, and they were trying to enforce a particular political orthodoxy. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but it turns out that that's not necessarily a great business model. And reports are that the Colbert Show was losing something like $50 million a year. And you can only sustain that for so long. And so, again, I think people want to look for the tree. They want to look for something, specific and nefarious, because they are whistling past the graveyard of these bigger macro shifts that are taking place in media. And yes, I think those bigger macro shifts have to do with President Trump, but not for the reasons that people think. It's because he hasn't played the game of allowing the legacy mainstream media to set the narrative.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about nefariousness potentially behind the scenes of the Paramount Skydance merger, which actually required your approval at the FCC, cleared that hurdle last week. Do you believe that CBS axed Colbert and The Late Show in any way to win your favor, to win Donald Trump's favor in the merger process?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, look, the FCC's own review process here, we ran our normal course standard process. We had a full commission vote. All the commissioners, there's 3 of us, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, voted. There was people that were expressing concern that we weren't going to have a commission level vote on the item. We did. We ran our normal process there. In terms of the amount of time that it took and the timing of the review itself, it was right in the sweet spot of how long it takes the agency, both now and the prior administration, to review deals like this. And so these things were all, as I said many, many times, unrelated. There was that private lawsuit that was settled. There was a news distortion complaint that continues to be pending at the FCC. And then there was the transaction itself. And we just ran our normal process on it.
Was from your perspective, The Late Show operating in the public interest? And did you have any prior conversations with them about whether they were operating in the public interest with that show with Colbert? I mean, they're still on and they're still doing their thing. So did any of that go on?
No, I mean, there's no discussions from my part about the Colbert Show at all. I mean, I learned about it the way everyone else learned about it, or I guess most everybody learned about it, which was on news reports. It wasn't part of the FCC's review or transaction one way or the other.
Over the years, I hope I've been clear about this. I'm not just pro-birth, I'm pro-life. And being pro-life, of course, means standing with mothers not only before their baby is born, but long after. And that is exactly why I partner with Preborn. Preborn is awesome. They don't just save babies, they make motherhood abundantly possible. They provide free ultrasounds and share the truth of the gospel with women in crisis. And then they stay. How great is that? With real practical help. They are there, including financial support for up to 2 years after the baby is born. I say again, how awesome is that? And here's where you can make a difference. Just $28 provides a free life-saving ultrasound. One chance for a mother to see her baby. And when she does, she is twice as likely to choose life. It is incredibly powerful. Preborn is trying to save 70,000 babies this year. This is what true Christ-centered compassion looks like, not just for the baby, but for the mother too. So don't just say you're pro-life, live it. Help save babies and support mothers today. Go to preborn.com/Emily or call 855-601-2229. That's preborn.com/Emily.